Okay. Let's see how we go. Try and I never can see the comments when I'm doing the video. So we're going to make this video yesterday. Yesterday I made a video. See if anyone comes in. Yesterday I made a video about the yesterday I made a video, right, one's come in. So I hope everything looks good there. I can't see from in here, so I just am dependent on you in there to let me know if anything's wrong. I've got my phone here so I can see. Now, anyway, today we did the Magna Carta and we did the 1688 Bill of Rights and we did the whakaputanga, okay? So we'll just have a little review here. That we had the 1688 Bill of Rights, which was here, and the Glorious Revolution, and that was with Her Majesty the Queen as the instrument of God to protect our rights. And that opposition to the 1215 Magna Carta. I see many sites telling you to stand Magna Carta. Oh, right, I can see Linda there. Oh, no, let's say I can see Fidget there. So that's good that someone says it. Always helps me if someone, so I know that we're on the right track. And if everyone can say, yes, I can see, and everything like that. Anyway, we did the Magna Carta. I'm seeing a lot of people telling all of New Zealand to stand under that. So then we went to, where do we go here? We went to slide number 9, which one of my gave to me. And in this, it's telling you about the Magna Carta. That actually, but the picture is just a slightly wrong. Because the true picture that over here we've got, oh, very good. Over here we've got the popes and not only the popes, the rabbis, and even the English church leaders are over here. And these 3 church leaders appoint the king. All right, so, and the king is absolute. The king doesn't need to be born to it. And then the king, I am the king, I own all the land. But only if these leaders, the religious leaders, allow him to. If the religious leaders are not happy with the king, they would go over here to the barons and the peasants and get them to rise up against the king. And then the baron would receive land from the king. It was important that the king, he was kind of between the rock and a hard place because he had to keep the barons happy, he had to keep the people happy, and he had to keep the religious leaders happy. And so he would give land to the barons and the knights. And the barons and the knights he would say, I'm a villain, and the knight gave me some land, so I have to work on this land, and I must give him gifts and taxes, and I can't leave the land. He's bound to the land, and he can't leave, okay? So that's what we learned about in this Magna Carta. Going over to number 17, under the Magna Carta, forever in perpetuity, the church nobles and the barons and their heirs have elected themselves to govern forever in perpetuity. The church nobles would force the peon slaves, that was the English slaves, to obey the barons. And the barons, to the best of their ability, would force the serfs and the slaves to obey the church. So these 2 here, the church and the barons, had each other's back. And the king was not as powerful as what you think. the church leaders were much more powerful, and the barons were actually powerful because they worked with the people. The peon serfs, the children, must pay the debts of their parents in the event of death. And this is how we know that the Jewish lords were also included in the Magna Carta, because the Jewish lords were collecting money from the parents. And this is what they said, all of these people, the king, the church, the nobles, the barons, the Jewish lords, all said that in return for protection and justice and the right to cultivate food from the farmlands for food, the people must work for free for the lords forever. And this is why they threw out the Magna Carta, okay? And you can see here, again, from one of my savage friends, don't forget that we've got the religious leaders over here, just any religion. Any of the religion, nobody was allowed to follow any other religion except their religion. And if you didn't follow their religion, you were tortured and killed and all of that. And this just shows you that the king gave the land to the nobles gave the land to the knights gave protection to the peasants and let them work on the land. Then the peasants provided food, services, and money to the knights, and the knights provided some of that to the nobles, and then the nobles passed it on to the king, and the king passed it all on. So you can see the load. If you look at the load on the shoulders of the common people, these were the commoners down here. So these were the commoners, and if you look at the load on their shoulders, in fact, they had to carry all of these people. So it was a very hard time for them. And this protected the Protestants. What is a Protestant? A Protestant does not need to be a religious person. Member of any church, or even if you're an atheist, you can be a Protestant. A Protestant is a person that denies the universal authority of the Pope or other religious leaders, such as Islamic leaders or Jewish leaders, and they affirm the reformation of the church, that the principles of justification by faith alone, and the primacy of the Bible as the only source of revealed truth. What has happened is that the Catholic religions, the Islamic religions, and the Jewish religions have all made their interpretations of the Bible, and they've added many, many laws that they believe to be true. But the Protestant is saying that the King James Bible is the only source of truth, and we're only taking our information from them. Okay? And then moving on from there to number 30, then we came to Her Majesty, the Queen, the glorious instrument of God to give us our rights. This is just a quick review, and then we'll get to the good stuff in a minute. Okay? So the subjects which are Protestants may have arms for their defence suitable to their conditions and as allowed by law. Now take note here, it says Protestants, and the reason why the other religions were not allowed to have arms was because they had many laws in their biblical texts that permitted the killing or the punishment of the Protestant people, and so they only allowed the Protestants to have the arms. We were given the right of the subjects to petition the king, and all commitments and prosecutions of such petitioning are illegal. This right to petition the Queen was removed from New Zealand legislation in the 19th, the exact date, but we're going to learn about it later. We have the right to freedom of election. Under the Magna Carta, you have no rights to freedom of election, so that's why you don't stand under it. We have the right to the election of members of Parliament, and we have the right to juries, and also the right to courts. Now, I'm going to just quickly tell you, we have, under the Bill of Rights, we have courts of law. And under the religious, they have courts, which are different. They have courts of, that's an F, justice. So whenever you hear these people talking about, when they're talking about this thing here called law, what they're talking about is courts of justice, which are not the same as courts of law. In courts of justice, the jurors can decide any punishment that they choose, and it can be according to their Jewish biblical text or their Catholic biblical text or their Islamic biblical text, and these come under the Noahide laws. Okay, and under the Noahide laws, all people that don't follow their courts of justice are called Noachides. Chides. We're going to learn about that later. But under the 1688 Bill of Rights, we follow courts of law. And the people that are trying to tell you not to follow the law, courts of law, you're going into a very dangerous ground with those courts of justice. It's just here, it says no cruel or unusual punishments are to be inflicted. And the most important one was freedom of speech, and that the freedom of speech in debates or proceedings in Parliament ought not to be impeached or questioned in any court or place out of Parliament. And the reason why they said that is that under all of those religions, the Jewish religion, the Islamic religion, and the Catholic religion, you're not allowed to speak against the church. It's blaspheme to speak against the church. And under their laws, you can be decapitated for speaking out against the church. So you can be decapitated. And that is why we made freedom of speech very important, because nobody could bring the Magna Carta down because nobody was allowed to speak against it. And we are only allowed to speak against it today because of this law, not because of the 1990 Bill of Rights of New Zealand or any of the other Bills of Rights in any of the other countries. The only one, the reason why we're allowed to speak freely is because of this law here in the 1688 Bill of Rights that is currently recognised in New Zealand law. And you knew that if you go under the Magna Carta, you are under the dictatorship of all of these people. And they say, we have granted to God that we will have this Magna Carta charter confirmed for us. Us is them and ours in perpetuity. You come under the 1688 Bill of Rights, there's no such thing. We only have a majesty who is the glorious instrument of delivering the kingdom from popery, and arbitrary power. We have to go everywhere for that. So this here, the 1688, protects us from the arbitrary power that they granted themselves. So these are two opposing documents, and you either got to choose. You can choose whichever one you want. They're still legal today, both of them. You can either stand under these people of the Magna Carta, or you can stand under Almighty God with the Queen, Her Majesty the Queen, as the instrument to uphold it. Now, where am I going down next? I'm not going here. Okay, I'm going to, wait a minute, let me just check here. Right, 30 to 36 we've done, and now we're on 50. Right, so that's where we left off yesterday. And remember, we'll just go here, that papists are debarred from the crown. Catholics are not allowed to govern over us. Neither are Islamic priests, and neither are rabbis allowed to govern over Protestants, not because we are against their religions. We love their religions. They can follow those religions. If anybody can follow those religions if you want to, but they can't govern over Protestants because of their strict laws of decapitation and cruel and unusual punishments. So that's why they've been taken out. Didn't I put it there? Manuka, manuka. I have to start again. So here's manuka, henare. Now what we're talking about is that in our countries of Australia, Canada and New Zealand and South Africa, they have changed all our laws. Since 1975, they changed all of our laws. And the reason why they're changing it, manuka, henare, remember him, he is the Maori, he is the Catholic executive officer of the Catholic Commission for the Justice, Peace and Development in the 1980s. He worked for the Catholic Church for more than 40 years. He was the founding director of Caritas New Zealand here, and he was very involved in the 70s and 80s in teaching the Catholic leaders how to get around the whakaputanga. Now, these are the laws that they've got in order to make New Zealand a dictatorship under the leaders that they want. They've got to get around all the laws that we had in New Zealand. New Zealand to Australia and Canada, because we had this country locked up tighter than a mouse's ear. It was tight. We had the 1688 Bill of Rights. We had the 1852 Constitution. We had the 1835 whakaputanga, and we had the 1840 Treaty. We had more documents than any other country to protect us from all of these people that are trying to take us over and take over governance. So they've been whittling away at these for the last 40 years. So they brought this guy through the Maori, and the important thing that we learned yesterday about the Declaration of Independence is that the Hereditary Chiefs, here is the Declaration of Independence of New Zealand and the heads of tribes. And I asked one of my Maori friends today, and here Manuka Henare has removed the Hereditary Chiefs and the heads of tribes, and he has changed them to be the absolute leaders of the tribes. Now, Hereditary Chiefs, just in its saying, means that they have to be born to New Zealand and they have to be a chief of one of the tribes. And that it can be either an chief, well, it says they're Hereditary Chiefs, so they do have to be a hereditary as a chief. So if it didn't go to the son, it would go to the uncle. If it didn't go to, it would go to the nephew or whatever. But over here, these absolute leaders over here, this could be anyone. It could be the Pope. And he said, we declare the independence of our country to be constituted and declared independence. But here they didn't. Here he says, we declare the authority and leadership of our country. That is going to these leaders. Then over here, this is the translation. This was the translation in 1986. This is the translation in 1986 by Manuka Henare. Here they says the sovereign, The sovereign power and the authority in the territories lay exclusively with the hereditary chiefs and the heads of tribes in their collective capacity. And over here, the translation by Manuka, he's changed it to be the sovereign kingship of the kingitanga. Who is the king? The king doesn't even need to be a Maori. According to the first one here, the absolute leader of the tribe, there's no hereditary kingship here. So that king could be a king from any country in the world. It's a very dangerous translation that he's done. I'm not going to do it all. And he says he calls themselves the true leaders of the Tino Rangatira. Just have to check there. Now they're calling this document, I just want to tell you, they're calling this document, they're not calling it the Declaration of Independence. They're calling this document the Te Waka Minenga o Ngā Hapu o New Tirini. And our one is actually called only the Declaration of Independence. Whenever they're talking about this, they're talking about the absolute leader that we don't know who they are. It doesn't need to be a chief, as I've said. So in the next section, in the third section, we see again hereditary chiefs and heads of the tribes agree to meet in Congress in Waitangi. This denotes a parliamentary session for the purpose of framing laws for the dispensation of justice. So he's talking about they're going to go to Congress, the heads and the chiefs, and they're going to frame laws that are going to help their people. Here they've said, we the true leaders, which we don't know who they are, they're going to have a formal gathering. Now, this is not Congress. Congress is a parliament, and a formal gathering is just a meeting. And it says, each year we are going to enact laws. So that basically means that Manuka, Henare, and his mates, whoever they are at the Catholic Church, are going to make the laws by themselves, and then they're going to meet everybody at the hui, at the meeting, and they're going to enact the laws that they've already made, whereas these ones are merely going to frame the laws in their parliamentary meeting. And then we just went over the last bit there of, in the English version is the hereditary chiefs, and in Manuka's translation, the absolute leaders of the tribes. In the English version, the independence of our country. In the Manuka translation, the authority and leadership of our country. In the English version, we're using the United Tribes. In the translation, he's changed the name to be an entirely new federation that we don't know who they are. And he says the Sacred Confederation of Tribes of New Zealand. In the English version, all sovereign power and authority to reside entirely and exclusively in the hereditary chiefs and heads of tribes in their collective capacity. In the translated version, the sovereign kingship of the kingitanga to belong solely to the true leaders. So the collective capacity of the hereditary chiefs and the heads of tribes has been removed from you, New Zealand Maori. It hasn't been removed from us, the Pākehā. It's been removed from you, New Zealand Maori, all across New Zealand, because in an actual fact, the translation speaks about the entire country of New Zealand, but if you look here, it says the northern parts of New Zealand, but it says being assembled, declare the independence. But on this one, he says, to the north, it says, we're the absolute leaders of New Zealand. Look carefully. We're the absolute leaders of New Zealand, and then there's a break. And then it says, to the north of hierarchy, having assembled in the Bay of Islands on the 28th of October, 1835. So it's worded very differently. In law, when you're talking about law, a change of one word can change the entire article. And this is what they've done. They've changed. He says, the hereditary chiefs and tribes of the northern parts of New Zealand. But here he says, we the absolute leaders of the tribes. So, leaders of the tribes of New Zealand. Okay? And then there's a break, and then he says, to the north of hierarchy, having assembled in the Bay of Islands. So, by putting this break in here, I'll just erase it. By putting this breaker in here, it's almost like a full stop here, almost. And you see there's none here. That's almost like a full stop. And so you can characterize that as two sentences is what you can. And so in the whakaputanga, they've given themselves absolute leadership over the entire country. So this includes all the South Island Maori. So just thought I'd tell you that. The next thing here that was removed was subjects. Now, I remember that I told you that when you stand as subjects, here's subjects. There are two types of subjects. There is one type of subject that stands under the Magna Carta. So these subjects here are ruled by the church. So you can stand under there because we are all sovereign beings. Nobody can force you to stand under any law if you don't want to. You don't even have to stand under any of these laws. You can be free. But if you do stand under a law, you can get some protections by that. And so you can choose whichever one that you want to stand under. So we've got the subjects that stand under the Magna Carta. We've also got the subjects that stand under the 1688 Bill of Rights, and that is under Her Majesty. Okay? And so if you stand under the Magna Carta, you get the rights of the Magna Carta. And if you stand under the Majesty, you get the rights of the 1688. One of the things that you can't do is stand under both of them because they are conflicting documents. They are absolutely opposed to each other. So you have to choose which one you're going to stand under. Now, the English people that went to New Zealand, the Scottish and Irish, they all stood under Her Majesty, His Majesty, the King of England. And this subject here, you know which one they're standing under it because it says so here. If you're standing under His Majesty, the King of England, then you are a subject and you are protected under this 1688 Bill of Rights. And what Manuka Henare has done in the translation is he has removed all the English people of New Zealand, or can we say white people without being racist? He's removed all of the white people that were mentioned in the whakaputanga Being mentioned as subjects in the whakaputanga automatically puts them under the protection of these rights. And having the word subjects removed, and he's also removed majesty up here. So he's removed two key words, subject and majesty, and he's only given you Pākehā. As a Pākehā or as a white person, you are not protected by these rights anymore. This was done in 1986. And when we use the king here, we don't know which king that he's talking about. Now, in February of 1986, the Queen came to New Zealand, and there was a big newspaper clipping that said, "Farewell to the Queen." This was in February 24th, 1986. Then in November, the Pope came to meet Geoffrey Palmer of 1986. The Pope came. And then what happened was in 1986, in December, our 1852 Constitution was removed, and we were given a 1986 unwritten Constitution, which we're not going to go over today. Now, these are all the things that we've got to do. So his name is Hugh Kafaru. Hugh Kafaru. Now, here's, if you've seen my other videos on the Marsden videos, when the whakaputanga was written, it was written by Hobson and religious leaders that tricked the New Zealand Maori. They were no longer under the protection of Her Majesty or New South Wales. And after that, the religious went and bought up all the lands. Now, Hugh Kafaru's great-great-grandfather was the person that sold all of Auckland to Hobson. So this family deeply involved with this treaty, so they know what they're doing. They're not a silly people. And Hugh Kafaru worked as head of UNESCO for around about 30 years or more. He also worked for the United Nations Economic and Social Council, and he also worked for the Food and Agriculture. Most importantly, he was a president. We're going to learn about this Polynesian society later, but I have done videos about it if you know my videos. So he was the president of this Polynesian society that for the last 200 years have been trying to get New Zealand out of the clutches of Her Majesty's Bills of Rights. Now his daughter, Marata Kafaru, she's with Ngāpuhi, it's all Ngāpuhi and Ngāti Whatua, and she received a Rhodes Scholarship. And if you're from America, you know all about these Rhodes Scholarships, that we're noticing that all of these high-up leaders are receiving scholarships, specifically Rhodes Scholarships. She went over to England, to the Oxford University, and she studied anthropology, which is like a history. And then she went to work in the University of Auckland and Otago. And then she began to do work at the United Nations and UNESCO and the New Zealand Historic Places. Now, Marata also, this is apparently her sister, apparently. Margaret. Now, don't quote me as saying this is absolutely true, because I'm still a little bit confused about this family. And for such a famous family, you'd think that there would be just article after article after article, but it's very difficult to find information on them. And so this is Margaret. I won't draw on her head because I don't want to deface her. But I am not sure if these were actually the same person or if they're sisters or what. But this is Margaret. And she worked at the university, the same university as Maratha. Okay? And then both Maratha and Daddy worked for UNESCO and for the United Nations, and Daddy was the president of the Polynesian Society. Oh, I had it before. Well, I don't know if it's here. Okay, I had it. I haven't put it, unfortunately. No, I didn't. Okay, well, I'll just tell you. Both Margaret and Maratha worked. They worked on the treaty, and what they would have been doing is matching up these laws of the Whakaputanga and the new translated treaty. We're going to go and talk about the differences that they've made in the treaty. Now, I want to explain to you about this word here, majesty. You're going to need to understand why it's so important, because it's not actually the word queen. The word queen by itself doesn't mean anything. The word queen by itself could be a rock group. Here's queen. The queen word also in Maori language is actually a fruit. It's called a queenie, and it's called a fruit. So this word queen by itself means nothing. Even in law, if any documents signed by Her Majesty, they must put Her Majesty the Queen or His Majesty the Queen, or Majesties, and it is the word, it's not the word queen that gives them the sovereign power. It is the word majesty that means sovereign power, authority, or dignity, and it means it's always referring to a reigning sovereign and their consorts of Her Majesty's government. Now, that is not the same as queen. You've got here queen of government. That's not talking about Her Majesty. That's just talking about some queen that we don't know. It can say the Queen of England government. Here, my writing's not that good. It can also say that, but that is still not Her Majesty the Queen. The only way that queen is the reigning sovereign is if you use these two words together. In the really big ones, the big laws, it would have Her Royal Highness. Her Royal Highness, and then it would have, it can have just Highness, but it would still have Majesty. This is the key word, and that's why you see H, full stop, M, and Queen. So make sure you remember that. If you look, here is the Treaty of Waitangi, which I might change the colour here because there's a lot of red in there. Shall I try, I don't like purple, let's try blue. Can you see the blue? So, Her Majesty Queen Victoria of the United Kingdom of Great Britain and Ireland. And this is how you know that they're talking about Queen Victoria. But in his translation, he's merely written Victoria, the Queen of England. So that is not a monarch that he's talking about, in my opinion. And we're talking about, whenever you hear them talking, if they're talking about the Treaty of Waitangi, they're talking about the English version. And this one, they don't call it the treaty. They call it Treaty of Waitangi. And you should listen to them. The United Nations only recognises the Treaty of Waitangi. And why doesn't the United Nations recognise the Treaty of Waitangi? They came up with this cock and bull story that they only recognise the language that it was written in. But in an actual fact, this treaty here, the English treaty, is tied to subjects. And I told you this is tied to subjects under the 1688 Bill of Rights, and also constitutions. So they must have a constitution to go with this. And the reason why you often hear them talking about this Treaty of Waitangi is the United Nations was not allowed to accept us under their laws as long as we had the Treaty of Waitangi, because they are a foreign power, and that is illegal under the 1688 Bill of Rights. And secondly, many of their declarations in there are against our 1688 Bill of Rights, especially to do with religion and especially to do with foreigners being allowed to govern in our parliament. So the United Nations only recognises the Treaty of Waitangi, and I'm here to tell you it's a new document. It's not a translation. It's a brand new document, and this is what we have to understand. So, Her Majesty Queen Victoria, the change is Victoria, Queen of England. That could be anyone. The next one, the change, I'm not going to read this because you can go and read it yourself. But here that we've used regarding her royal favour, the native chiefs and tribes of New Zealand. And this does not use native chiefs. It only uses chiefs. Now, native chiefs, it says native chiefs, which means that they are native to New Zealand. This one uses only chiefs, so it means that they don't actually have to be a native of New Zealand. And here they've used sub-tribes, and the Queen has used tribes, which is a little bit different. The Maori will know about that. And it says, anxious to protect their rights and secure them in enjoyment of peace. This one says, this has changed because we understand what the Queen's rights are talking about. They're talking about that. So here he has removed it, which is very different. So she's saying to protect their rights, and he's saying preserve their chieftainship. And we don't know who the chiefs are. And down here, we've got, in consequence of the great number of Her Majesty's subjects and rapid extension, here he has given us the word also because there are many of her subjects already living on this land. And he's called it the Queen's Government here. And if you understand the 1688 Bill of Rights, the Queen is not involved with the government. the Queen protects our rights, and it is the Parliament that governs. And here's called the Queen's government, which is not talking about Her Majesty, the Queen. It says, negotiate with the people of New Zealand, negotiate with the people of New Zealand to the end that their chiefs will agree to a Queen's government. So she didn't say that to agree to a Queen's government. She said she was anxious to protect their rights, and she wanted to secure laws as being necessary for her subjects to continue living there. And but he has said, we'll negotiate with the people of New Zealand to the end that their chiefs will agree to a Queen's government. Now, is this when New Zealand was incorporated under the Queen in right of New Zealand? I suspect it is. And this is the document signed in Asa. And then it says, and also because there are many of her subjects living on the land. So he hasn't, here we have an agreement that she's going to give rights of property to the subjects, but here they're not giving any rights, but he's just saying, oh yes, in an afterthought, that some of her subjects are living. So we move on. Her Majesty, again, we know we're talking about the Queen of England, and he's changed it to be just the Queen. And it says to desire establish a civil government. A civil government is a government ruled by civilians through Parliament, but he has removed the parliamentary civil government, and he's just put that the Queen desires to establish a government so that no evil will come to the Maori and the European living in the lawlessness. But she didn't say that. She said she's going to establish a civil government, and that with the absence of the necessary laws would be evil for them if there were no laws. Institutions alike to the native population and to her subjects. So in this preamble, Her Majesty the Queen is asserting that she is there to protect, by our laws and institutions, all of the natives and all of her subjects already living there, and all of her subjects that will go there. In his preamble, he has totally removed subjects, and he has totally removed the native population, and he has totally removed the protection of laws. After that, it's in my power to authorise William Hobson, the captain and Her Majesty's Royal Naval Consul and Lieutenant Governor of such parts of New Zealand, as may be or hereafter shall be Her Majesty. So this is where they're talking about the cessation of Maori government to her Queen. Now, don't be scared by that, about this ceding sovereignty, because sovereignty does not mean giving up your lands. Sovereignty is to do with governance, and the sovereign leader is a government that is voted in by the people. It doesn't mean that she was taking your land. They're lying to you about this. And I must have another session to explain sovereignty, but I didn't in this one. So the Queen, there's no Majesty here, has appointed me, William Hobson. Whereas here has been graciously pleased to empower This is what Hobson talked. Her Majesty has been graciously pleased to empower and authorize me. So his authority comes from Her Majesty. And however, in his translation, there is no authority given to William Hobson. And so it just says that the Queen has appointed, which is very different. There's a big difference between being appointed and having authority. And here, once again, we've used Queen. And it says, for Hobson to be the governor for all parts of New Zealand, shortly to be received by the Queen and those to be received hereafter. And presents to the chiefs of the Confederation of the Subtribes. It's very different here because he talks about the chiefs of the Confederation, but Her Majesty talks about including the confederated and independent chiefs. So she's saying that this deal is not only for the confederated tribes of the Whakaputanga. This is also including the independent chiefs. The independent chiefs, once again, have been removed from Kawharo's translation. Now that is significant for New Zealand Maori. Let's go to Article the First. In Article the First, we've got the chiefs of the Confederation of the United Tribes of New Zealand and the separate and independent chiefs. And here he's removed the independent chiefs and he's just said chiefs of the Confederation and all the chiefs. We don't know who they are. And the chiefs of the Confederation, well, if you tie Maori's translation to the meaning of chiefs, then it's not talking about the hereditary chiefs. If you liken it like this, the English, all right, I'll write it here for you. So the English version of the treaty, you can match it to the vocabulary because you can match it to the English. How can I write this slow? You can I don't have a pen. You can match it to the English Whakaputanga. And we know that because they had to get the signers of the Whakaputanga to sign the treaty first. Otherwise, the treaty would not have been valid without them. And so when she's talking about separate and independent chiefs, she's talking about hereditary chiefs. So you've got to look at these four documents together. So these are hereditary chiefs that are born to New Zealand. Now, you can liken the Kawharu here, the Kawharu version, which is a translation, and his is matched to the translation Once you understand all of this, we will have discussions about it and you'll be able to really understand what we're talking about. So the Kawharo version is matched to the translation of the Whakaputanga. I'm not going to hurry this video because we have to get this right. We cannot make mistakes. So we have to know what we're talking about. So when he's talking about the chiefs here, We're not talking about the hereditary chiefs. What we're talking about is the absolute leaders, which we don't know who they are. To the first article, he says, he says, we the absolute leaders of the tribes, but we don't know who they are, and they don't necessarily need to be a New Zealand born person. So whenever you hear them talking about the Te Wakamenga, or whatever they call it, the Wakamenga or something, I can't get the spelling right, please forgive me. When they're talking about the Wakamenga, they're talking, and then they're talking about, this is called Treaty of Waitangi. They're talking about these two together. When you hear the government, this is why New Zealand is so confused. When you hear the government talking about the whakaputanga and the treaty, you'll understand, you can get a vision in your head that they're talking about this one under Her Majesty, okay? So, the separate and independent chiefs article, it says Her Majesty the Queen of England, and then it says absolutely and without reservation all the rights and powers of sovereignty, which means governance. It does actually mean governance. It doesn't mean claiming your land. It means governance, which puts you under the protection of the rights. And this is the protection that they're talking about. They're not talking about military protection, although you're entitled to that under the 1688. They're talking about the Bill of Rights and the constitutional law that you're protected under. And this has been totally removed. And it says, which the said confederation or the individual chiefs respectively exercise or possess. So she's saying that sovereignty lays with them. She's not saying that sovereignty lays with me. She said the sovereignty lays with the chiefs, or may be supposed to exercise or to possess over their respective territories. This is really important. Oh, get that piece out there. Where's it going to go? It says possess over respective territories as the sole sovereigns thereof. Now, New Zealand Maori, all of you out there, the sole sovereigns thereof of the independent chiefs and the hereditary chiefs has been removed from the first article. It's been totally removed. So I'll remove all that for you. The sole sovereigns of the independent and individual collective chiefs has been removed from Kafaru's version. And not only that, here's put, who have not joined that confederation give absolutely to the Queen of England forever the complete government over their land. Who is the Queen of England? It's not Her Majesty. I'll tell you that right now. This is not Her Majesty. Queen of England could be the Queen, the City of London. It could be the New York Stock Exchange. And I'll tell you something very dangerous about his translation. He's put in here forever. So this means that they have signed documents that have absolute leader. Now, you're not going to see this, but your children are going to see it forever. And the Queen didn't put forever, so I don't know how the New Zealand Maori are going to undo this. But with manukas, te wakaminga, absolute leaders that do not have to be New Zealand-born Maori, and with his Queen of England, which could be anyone, of forever, of government over the land, your children, it's most likely that your children will not be governed by New Zealand Maori. They will be governed by someone else, in my opinion. In this one, in the second article, I'm not going to read it all, but I'm just going to show you the discrepancies. Whenever she talks, it's always going to say, Her Majesty the Queen of England. And once again, he's used only the Queen of England. Any legal documents that are accepted by Her Majesty the Queen have Her Majesty the Queen, and Majesty is never, never, never addressed as simply Queen of England. So it's not Our Majesty that he's talking about. And then it says the respective families and individuals. But she says to the chiefs and tribes of New Zealand and to the respective families and individuals thereof. Now, this includes all of the Pākehā here. It doesn't have to be a family member of a Maori. It just says of New Zealand and to the respective families and individuals. Well, he's put, agrees to protect the chiefs, the sub-tribes, and all the people of New Zealand. Now this, I don't think it really matters too much. The significant thing that you need to focus on, what they've got you doing is focusing on, they've got you focusing on all the people. But what you should be focusing on is this here, Queen of England, and this difference here, Her Majesty. And we don't need to have all the people because we've already got all the people here. Now, once again, Her Majesty has said, but the chiefs of the United Tribes and the individual chiefs yield to Her Majesty the exclusive right of preemption. I'm going to talk about that another day, but I'm not going to talk about it today. He says, exercise of village, but on the other hand, the chiefs of the Confederation and all the chiefs will sell. Now, this is a problem. I'm not going to explain it to you today, but this preemption was a law that applied to Her Majesty the Queen over New Zealand since 1776. And I'm not going to tell you today, but it is significant. Maybe I'll come back tomorrow and tell you about that. But the chiefs of the Confederation and all the chiefs will sell the land to the Queen. Now, I wonder if I should tell you about that. Oh, no, I'll do it tomorrow. Should I tell you? Yes, I'm going to tell you. Right, we're only on the second. If we have time, I'll come back and tell you. But this is significant because he says that they will sell the land. And this is why we know that this document is not true. Because in this one it says Her Majesty will have the exclusive right of preemption over the land. over here, in the third article, in consideration thereof of Her Majesty the Queen of England, and here he's got, for this agreed arrangement, therefore concerning the government of the Queen. So he's said, we've already agreed to make this arrangement, but Her Majesty has said to please consider this arrangement. And he says the Queen of England will protect the ordinary people, and here is the significant bit, and will give them, look here, rights and duties of citizenship. But over here, Her Majesty will give her royal, he's removed that there's no royal, he hasn't put it, her royal protection, and imparts to them all the rights and privileges of British subjects. And as a subject, you come under the protection of the 1688 Bill of Rights. And it was this protection that the New Zealand Maori needed, if you've ever watched my Marsden tapes, because the religious leaders were taking over New Zealand and they needed protection from that. And so that's why Her Majesty made them subjects. Subjects has been totally removed, and the New Zealand Maori, all New Zealanders actually, have become independent chiefs here again of New Zealand claiming the authority, and he has put the chiefs of the Confederation, which has excluded the independent chiefs. So I'm saying to you, New Zealand Maori, that the translations, actually I'll do one more video on this tomorrow if I have time, or maybe not tomorrow, maybe. So what we're going to do is, I just want to tell you this. In 1908, the court case, because they were fighting over whether the New Zealand Maori were subjects or not. And it was decided in this court case that every person of the Maori race in New Zealand, whether born before or since New Zealand became a dependency of Great Britain, shall be taken and deemed to be a natural born subject of Her Majesty. See, they don't use this word queen. They're not going to use this word queen anywhere. You look in any document that Her Majesty, and they're only going to use Her Majesty, and they are natural born subjects. So, manuka henare, due to this court case here alone, manuka henare, together with Hugh Kafaru, have removed New Zealand Maori illegally as subjects. Removed Maori illegally as subjects. And so this is very bad. And so under the UN, this was how they were able to do the whakaputanga. I'll do another video tomorrow. Because the UN UNDRIP, the UNDRIP then was able to constitute New Zealand under its laws in 2010. So in order for that to occur, first they needed to get rid of the Declaration of Independence. I wish I could type this. I'm going to improve my computer skills. Let me just finish up here. So they needed to get rid of the Declaration of Independence first, because that had the collective chiefs, and they needed to make an absolute leader. Secondly, they needed to get rid of the Treaty of Waitangi. The treaty, well, actually, sorry, excuse me. In New Zealand, the first thing they had to get rid of was the 1688 Bill of Rights, and they've had to get rid of that in Canada, Australia, and New Zealand, and South Africa. They had to get rid of the 1688 Bill of Rights. And the way that they did that is that they went to our laws and our declarations that we have with our native people, and they changed them. And so to get rid of the 1688, they had to get rid of the original of the Declaration of Independence. And then after that, they needed to get rid of the Treaty of Waitangi in its original form. So they got rid of these two documents, and they gave us two translations. And the major thing that they needed to do was remove New Zealand Maori as subjects, that we all know that as a subject you are protected by this. And so they removed New Zealand Maori as subjects from the treaty, in the treaty. They replaced it with the Te Wakaminga or something. And then they replaced it with this Treaty of Waitangi. And I'm just finishing this up for some people that are a bit slow and don't know. And in the Te Waka, they removed the independent chiefs, and they even removed hereditary chiefs, which is terrible for the country. And then in the Treaty of Waitangi, they removed the New Zealand Maori as subjects. Not only did they do that, they removed Her Majesty, the Queen, they removed Her Majesty or His Majesty, and they just gave you Queen of Government. And this 1986 was when New Zealand became a corporation. They had to get rid of these three first. And then in 2010, which the next video, I might do a little recap of these. And in 2010, the next one, we've got the King's flag. So this may well be the King that I told you in the whakaputanga. There is no directive. It has to be a New Zealand born Maori. It can be anyone. And they're calling this guy, I don't know, is that His Royal Highness there, standing under the whakaputanga flag. So do not fly this flag. You know that this is not your flag because it's got the black flimbriate. And your New Zealand flag has got white fimbriate. The New Zealand flag has got white fimbriate. And this fake flag has got black flimbriate here. And that's how you know that this is not your flag. So don't fly it. And there seems to be two here because there's this guy here. Well, this one is His Majesty Ariki Manukau. And he's also standing under this flag. And you can see here that it's got the black fimbriate. And he's, okay. So when you come next time, we're going to talk about the 1986 Constitution and the 1852 Constitution. That's it. Thank you, anybody that's managed to stay. You're very strong and very lovely. Good night. Thank you. Thank you so much. Bye-bye.